What if the legends we worshipped weren't allowed to be who they really were? What if the very contracts that made them stars also silenced their deepest truths? Behind the velvet curtain of Hollywood's golden age, not all secrets were hidden in the dark. Some were printed in ink, bound in legal clauses, and buried beneath carefully constructed personas. Studios didn't just control careers, they controlled identities, relationships, and morality itself. The public saw charisma, elegance, and poise. But what they didn't see, what they weren't meant to see, was a system built to protect illusions and punish authenticity. From forbidden affairs to exiles enforced by scandal, from orchestrated patriotism to strategic silence, many of the industry's most revered figures lived double lives, one for the camera, one for survival. And decades later, many of those secrets remain just whispers in biographies, or carefully omitted chapters in Hollywood retrospectives. Today, we're not just remembering stars, we're unsealing what they never spoke about. These are the 20 contracts, scandals, and secrets the legends took to their graves, or were forced to. Which one do you think they most regretted never revealing? 1. Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn. A love story buried in silence. They were one of Hollywood's most iconic pairs, on-screen chemistry that defined a generation. But off-screen, Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn's relationship was never acknowledged. Not in interviews, not in memoirs, and certainly not by the studio that banked millions off their undeniable bond. Tracy was married, devoutly Catholic, and refused to divorce. Hepburn, fiercely independent, accepted the role of the other woman, but only privately. Their love spanned 26 years, yet was never photographed outside of a set. Publicists orchestrated denials. The press played along. Even at Tracy's funeral, Hepburn sat far from the family, unseen, unmentioned. Why the secrecy? MGM feared scandal would tarnish both stars. Tracy's devout image and Hepburn's defiant persona didn't fit a narrative of adultery and quiet submission, so a contract of silence, written not on paper but through pressure and fear, was enforced. To the world, they were just colleagues. In truth, they were more, but they lived it in whispers. What does it say about a love story when even the legends involved weren't allowed to claim it? 2. Ingrid Bergman. From America's sweetheart to Hollywood exile, she was the luminous star of Casablanca, the embodiment of grace. But in 1949, Ingrid Bergman became a national scandal. She had left her husband and daughter, traveled to Italy to work with director Roberto Rossellini, and fell in love. When she became pregnant out of wedlock, America turned on her with ferocity. Senators denounced her on the floor of Congress. Newspaper headlines branded her a disgrace. Religious groups called for her films to be banned. The woman once held as a symbol of virtue was now public enemy of moral decay. Hollywood studios severed ties. Bergman fled, exiled, not by force, but by humiliation. For 7 years, she was persona non grata in the very industry she had helped define. And when she returned, with an Oscar for Anastasia, the stain never fully disappeared. What wasn't known then? Bergman had begged for a legal separation. She believed in love, not scandal. But the system had no room for nuance. The irony? Her performances were praised for emotional honesty, yet her personal honesty cost her everything. 3. John Wayne, the patriotic mask that hid a divided man. To many, he was America. The towering figure of John Wayne, with his gravel voice and square jaw, symbolized courage, loyalty, and conservative values. But that image wasn't just cultivated, it was curated, shaped by studio mandates and political alliances. Wayne was a fervent anti-communist, a vocal supporter of the House Un-American Activities Committee, and a co-founder of the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals. But privately, his views were more conflicted. He admired some leftist directors, questioned aspects of McCarthyism, and at times clashed with the very ideology he publicly embraced. The studio system, however, demanded consistency. Wayne became a brand, a weapon in cultural propaganda. Every script, interview, and appearance reinforced his role as the American ideal. To stray from it meant financial risk for him and the studios, so he stayed in line. What did he really believe? We may never know. But behind the patriot, behind the cowboy, was a man both used by and complicit in the machinery of ideological control. His silence wasn't just personal, it was systemic. 4. Bette Davis, the lawsuit that nearly ended her career. She was fierce, uncompromising, and unapologetically bold. But in 1936, Bette Davis did the unthinkable. She sued Warner Brothers, her own studio. Frustrated by being assigned mediocre roles and denied creative input, Davis left Hollywood for England, and challenged her contract in court. She claimed the studio had too much power, treating actors like products instead of artists. Warner Brothers responded with fury, branding her ungrateful and reckless. The press echoed the studio's narrative. In the public eye, Davis became difficult, dangerous, even. She lost the case. Yet the real punishment wasn't legal, it was reputational. For years, Davis had to claw her way back into respectability. What the public didn't know was that her contract demanded relentless work with no right to refuse roles. It was a golden cage. When she finally regained her status, it was by playing characters as defiant as she truly was. But even then, the lawsuit remained a cautionary tale, a message to every actor. Challenge the system, and it will bury you. 5. Montgomery Clift. The studio's silent cover. Up. Montgomery Clift had the kind of vulnerability that rewrote what it meant to be a leading man. But after a near-fatal car crash in 1956, his face was left partially paralyzed. For most actors, that would have been the end. Yet Clift's studio, desperate to protect their investment, orchestrated a quiet cover-up. Publicists fed false narratives. Directors used shadow-heavy cinematography. Scripts were rewritten to minimize close-ups. Even co-stars were instructed not to comment. The audience saw a slightly altered Clift, but not the pain, the surgeries, or the addiction to painkillers that followed. What was hidden was not just a disfigurement, but a man in agony, physically and emotionally. Why the secrecy? Because imperfection had no place in the Hollywood machine. Clift's tragedy was treated as a defect to erase, not a wound to heal. And behind his performances, post-crash, more intense, more fragile, was a man struggling to hold on to his identity. His silence wasn't pride, it was survival. 6. Judy Garland. The star they built, then broke. She was the voice of Somewhere Over the Rainbow, but Judy Garland's life was anything but idyllic. From age 13, MGM shaped every inch of her physically, emotionally, and chemically. Studio executives thought she looked too chubby for the screen. They forced her onto diet pills by 16. Sleeping pills followed, then amphetamines to wake up. Her schedule was brutal, her contracts unrelenting, and every breakdown was met not with empathy, but discipline. To the public, Garland was a wholesome, magical presence. But off-screen, she was crumbling. Marriages failed. Finances collapsed. And through it all, the studios kept selling the image while she quietly unraveled. She tried to speak out once. A rare interview in the early 60 seconds hinted at exploitation, but it was quickly buried, dismissed as a meltdown. The myth had to be preserved, even if it killed her, and in 1969, it did. 7. Rock Hudson, the studio's greatest illusion. To the world, Rock Hudson was the ultimate heartthrob, tall, charming, effortlessly masculine. But for decades, he lived a lie, carefully constructed by Universal Studios and enforced by a fortress of publicists, agents, and controlled appearances. Privately, Hudson was gay. But in 1,950 Seconds Hollywood, that truth was career suicide. The studio went to great lengths to protect their investment. Fake relationships were staged. Tabloids were paid off. Even co-stars were sworn to silence. Hudson played along. He dated women for show, kept his private life compartmentalized, and endured the psychological toll of erasure. The irony was cruel. His fame was built on romantic leads he could never live out in real life. When he was diagnosed with AIDS in the 1,980 seconds, the illusion shattered. His death became a national moment of reckoning, but the decades of suppression were already done. He had lived and died in the role the studio had assigned him, not just on screen, but in life. 8. Jean Harlow. The blonde bombshell they controlled to death. Jean Harlow was Hollywood's original platinum blonde, a star who radiated sensuality and innocence all at once. But what few knew was how little control she had over her own image or her own body. Her contracts dictated her weight, her hair color, even her public behavior. She was forced into grueling shooting schedules, often working through illness. When she began to suffer from kidney failure at just 26, the studio dismissed her symptoms as hysteria. Doctors were delayed, rest was denied, public appearances continued, all for the sake of preserving a profitable image. By the time she was hospitalized, it was too late. She died in 1937, her body broken, her truth obscured by a press campaign that painted her death as a tragic fluke. But those close to her knew the truth. She had been driven beyond the brink by a system that valued myth over mortality. 9. Errol Flynn. The legend built on suppression. Errol Flynn's swashbuckling persona made him a household name, but behind the charming rogue was a man constantly running from both his past and the studios, desperate to protect their golden goose. Flynn was investigated multiple times for alleged assaults cases that mysteriously disappeared. Witnesses changed stories. Evidence was lost. Warner Brothers had a vested interest in preserving his heroic image, even if it meant leaning on police departments and district attorneys. In private, Flynn was erratic, deeply troubled, and self-destructive. Yet every scandal was turned into spin. His recklessness became roguish charm. His legal issues became misunderstood playboy antics. But beneath the mask, there was a darker reality, one the public never saw, because they were never allowed to. 10. Marilyn Monroe. The diary no one was supposed to read. She was the most photographed woman of her time, yet the most misunderstood. Marilyn Monroe projected fantasy, but lived in fragmentation. The public saw curves, glamour, and whispers of scandal. What they didn't see, what they weren't meant to, was a spiral of surveillance, medication, and fear. Monroe kept a personal diary. In it were names, meetings, and secrets, many allegedly involving the Kennedys and studio executives. After her death, the diary vanished. Official reports said suicide. Others whispered assassination. What's certain is this: her death was followed by an aggressive campaign to sanitize her image and silence speculation. Studios, handlers, and politicians all had something to lose. The icon remained intact, but the woman behind it disappeared first, emotionally, then literally. And the diary? Still missing. 11. Dorothy Dandridge. The star Hollywood let burn. Dorothy Dandridge broke barriers as the first black woman nominated for a Best Actress Oscar. But her stardom came with a ceiling, one fortified by racism, tokenism, and brutal contracts. She was cast as exotic, never equal, paid less, offered fewer roles, forbidden from interracial screen kisses. Her relationship with white director Otto Preminger was kept secret, not for morality, but marketability. Studios feared Southern backlash. When she fought for better roles, she was labeled difficult. When she struggled financially, no studio offered support. By 42, she was dead from a drug overdose alone, bankrupt, and forgotten by the industry she helped transform. Her legacy was paved with elegance, but her career was carved by systemic silence. 12. Robert Walker. Madness behind the smile. Known for his boyish charm and captivating presence in Strangers on a Train, Robert Walker was Hollywood's rising star until his mind began to fracture. Behind the camera, he battled schizophrenia and alcoholism. His mental health deteriorated rapidly after a bitter divorce from Jennifer Jones, who married producer David O. Selznick. Rumors swirled that Selznick used his power to suppress Walker's career and gain full custody of their public narrative. Walker was institutionalized multiple times, each time with little press attention. The studio kept a tight lid on it, spinning his absences as exhaustion. On-screen, he remained controlled. Off-screen, he unraveled in silence. He died at 32. Under questionable medical treatment. To the studio, it was a tragedy. To those close to him, it was avoidable. But tragedies were easier to market than truth. 13. Marlene Dietrich, the bisexual icon who was erased by choice. Marlene Dietrich was everything Hollywood both craved and feared: enigmatic, seductive, fiercely independent. She wore men's suits before it was acceptable, loved across gender lines, and rejected the moral codes that governed the silver screen. In private, she had affairs with both men and women: Gary Cooper, Edith Piaf, John Gilbert, Mercedes D'Acosta. But the studios never let that narrative surface. Her contracts demanded she preserve the image of the unattainable, mysterious femme fatale. Press coverage was sanitized, interviews were staged. Dietrich never denied her truth, but she never volunteered it either. She mastered the art of living in plain sight, yet remaining unreadable. Hollywood couldn't risk her being defined by anything other than fantasy. And so, the woman who was so ahead of her time had to live decades ahead of society's permission. It was not shame that kept her silent, it was strategy. 14. Sal Mineo. The rebel who couldn't be who he was. He was unforgettable in Rebel Without a Cause. His performance raw, vulnerable, dangerously intimate. But for Sal Mineo, the role became prophecy. Off-screen, he was rumored to be gay, a label that in 1,950 seconds Hollywood could erase a career overnight. As he aged out of teen heartthrob status, the roles dried up. Studios grew cold. He was blacklisted without the paperwork, marginalized without public scandal. Behind closed doors, he lived cautiously. Auditions turned into dead ends. Former friends turned distant. Mineo tried to reinvent himself in theater, but the industry had decided his time was over. In 1976, he was stabbed to death outside his home. No motive linked to his identity was ever confirmed, but speculation surged. In life, he played roles scripted by others. In death, he was remembered for a question no one dared answer. 15. Rita Hayworth, the sex symbol who forgot herself. She danced into the world's heart with Gilda, her hair cascading like fire, her gaze promising danger and delight. But Rita Hayworth, the woman, was a construct. The studio changed her name, her hairline, her ethnicity. Born Margarita Cancino, she was told her Spanish heritage would limit her appeal. So Columbia Pictures remade her, piece by piece. She played the siren on screen, but longed for quiet and family. Her marriages failed, her trust eroded, and in her final years, she began forgetting lines, then names, then everything. Alzheimer's took her slowly, and with it, the constructed memory of Hollywood's favorite seductress. In her most heartbreaking quote, she once said, "Men go to bed with Gilda, but they wake up with me." But by the end, even she couldn't remember which was which. 16. George Reeves. Superman and the studio's final curtain. He wore the cape. He smiled for the cameras. George Reeves was the Man of Steel for a generation of American children. But off-screen, he battled depression, declining fame, and a toxic entanglement with the wife of a powerful MGM executive. In 1959, he was found dead from a gunshot wound, officially ruled a suicide. But details never added up. No fingerprints on the gun, no powder burns, multiple bullet holes, and conflicting witness accounts. Whispers pointed toward cover-up, but no charges were filed. What followed was silence, not just from the studios, but from friends, colleagues, and the press. Warner Brothers, where he'd once worked, buried any association. The narrative was tightly controlled. Superman had died tragically, mysteriously, but don't ask why. To this day, his death is a footnote in Hollywood's archive, a file still marked closed but never clean. 17. Anna May Wong, the star they never let shine. She was the first Chinese-American film star, mesmerizing in presence and talent. But Anna May Wong was constantly cast as the exotic seductress, never the heroine. Even when studios produced Asian-themed films, she was overlooked for white actresses in yellowface. When MGM made The Good Earth, Wong auditioned for the lead, a Chinese farmer's wife. She was rejected. The role went to Louise Rayner, who won an Oscar for playing the part Wong was born to inhabit. Her contracts were restrictive. She was forbidden from kissing white actors on screen, as interracial romance was immoral by production code standards. So Wong traveled to Europe, where roles were freer, but fame was fleeting. She returned to America late in her career, tired and disillusioned. Hollywood had opened a door for her, but never let her walk through it. 18. William Haynes, fired for falling in love. In the 1,920 seconds, William Haynes was one of MGM's top box office draws. Handsome, witty, effortlessly charming. He was also openly gay in his personal life, living with his partner Jimmy Shields in defiance of Hollywood's unwritten rules. Louis B. Mayer gave him an ultimatum: enter a sham marriage for the cameras, or lose everything. Haynes refused. He chose love. And Hollywood chose exile. His career was dismantled almost overnight. Roles vanished. Offers dried up. Gossip columns turned hostile. But Haynes didn't vanish. He reinvented himself as a top interior designer for stars and studios alike. Ironically, those who shunned him professionally hired him privately. He never returned to the screen. But he and Shields remained together for nearly 50 years, a love story far more authentic than anything scripted in the studio system. 19. Clara Bow, the it girl who lost everything to gossip. In the roaring 1,920 seconds, Clara Bow was the face of modernity, a flapper, a firecracker, the original it girl. Audiences adored her. But behind her rapid rise was a fragile foundation: childhood trauma, studio exploitation, and a media machine hungry for scandal. As Bow's fame soared, so did the whispers. Tabloids invented lurid tales of orgies, mental illness, and animal abuse, none substantiated, all damaging. Her studio refused to defend her, instead using the gossip to feed public fascination while protecting profits. Contracts kept her working through exhaustion. She suffered a nervous breakdown on set. By the early 1,930 seconds, she disappeared from Hollywood, labeled unstable, difficult, ungrateful. She spent her remaining years in seclusion, diagnosed with schizophrenia. The same industry that built her image had shredded her spirit quietly, efficiently, and without apology. 20. Fredric March, a reputation sanitized by studio willpower. Fredric March won 2 Oscars and was considered one of the finest actors of his era. But what many don't know is that early in his career, March was affiliated, however briefly, with a college fraternity that later merged with white supremacist ideology. When the connection surfaced decades later, studios moved swiftly, old press releases were buried, archive interviews disappeared, biographers were steered away from the topic. March himself had renounced any such beliefs long before his fame, but the stain lingered and the industry couldn't afford nuance. Rather than allow the public to interpret complexity, the studios chose erasure. His legacy remained polished, uncomplicated, and controlled. Hollywood didn't just rewrite its stars while they lived. It continued editing them long after they were gone. Bonus fact: the contracts that banned reality. For all the scandals and silences, perhaps the most chilling secret of Hollywood's golden age wasn't a single person but the contracts themselves. Buried in legalese were morality clauses, image rights, behavioral expectations. Stars couldn't marry without approval, couldn't gain weight, couldn't reveal mental illness, sexuality, or trauma. Some even signed away the right to speak publicly without prior clearance. These weren't contracts for actors, they were blueprints for manufactured identities. Studios didn't just manage reputations, they dictated reality. And if you broke the illusion, you didn't just lose a role, you disappeared. Even now, some of those contracts remain locked in private archives, sealed, undisclosed, legally untouchable. They're not just historical relics. They're evidence of an industry that once believed control was more valuable than truth. And maybe it still does. Hollywood's golden age gave us legends, but it also gave us illusions, contracts that erased truths, scandals buried beneath red carpets, lives rewritten, not by their owners, but by the studios that owned everything else. We remember the stars for their smiles, their poise, their unforgettable roles. But behind the velvet curtain was fear, manipulation, and silence. And sometimes, that silence screamed louder than any performance. Which of these secrets do you think should have been told? And which were better left buried? Let us know in the comment. If these truths change the way you see Hollywood, subscribe for more. The curtain may have fallen, but the shadows still linger.